In our previous module, we talked about what we need to do to prepare the on-prem environment to communicate or provide the synchronization process that's going to be occurring through the Azure AD Connect tool. And we also talked about other components that are involved with the Azure AD Connect tool that we're going to see in other courses, specifically the health monitoring and the ADFS configuration. But remember, in this module, we're going to be focusing on the synchronization component of Azure AD Connect, which means we're going to continue our discussion on the Azure AD Connect requirements because we're ready to rock and roll with this baby now. We're ready to install it and actually utilize it. We're going to look at that installation of Azure AD Connect and then how to configure a password synchronization, because ultimately that's what we want to do. We want to configure password synchronization to allow our users to have either same sign-on or single sign-on. And then we're going to look at a little bit more on the filtering. I introduced that in the last module. It's extremely powerful. We're going to explore soft match filtering as we go through this module here. So we're going to begin by discussing the Azure AD Connect preparation. Now, we talked a little bit about preparation in the previous module, but that was really getting your Active Directory on-prem ready for this. Now we're looking at the tool itself. So what we're going to need to do is make sure we have an Azure subscription. Now that may sound pretty obvious, but there are some subscriptions in Office 365 that don't include Azure AD. So we want to make sure our subscription does have that. We also want to make sure we verify the domain that's going to be used in Azure AD. Remember, in one of the other courses, we talked about how to verify the domain within Office 365 so it's recognized. So you'll have to make sure those steps were performed. Then we have some considerations regarding the number of objects that are going to be synchronized. By default, out of the box, you can handle 50,000 objects. No big deal. Anywhere between 50,000 and 300 objects, we have to go back to bullet number 2 in the slide here, and that's where we have to make sure our domain is verified. If you're going greater than 300,000 objects, you need to reach out to Microsoft and talk with them in regards to how you're going to manage that number of objects. And then we need to look at what our current forest functional level is at, because there's a minimum requirement of our forest functional level. And that's where we lead into our software requirements. That forest functional level has to be 2008 or higher, which means all of my domains that are part of this forest have to be running at the domain functional level of 2008 or higher. We also need Windows 2008 with the GUI. All the patches need to be applied to that Windows Server 2008 operating system, and that can be on a domain controller or a member server. We need to make sure we have the .NET Framework 4.5.1. We need PowerShell 3.0 or higher, and we need an instance of SQL Server. Now, by default, when you install Azure AD Connect, it will install SQL Server 2012 Express. But there's some limitations with that. For instance, it only supports up to 100,000 objects, and a database can only be 10 gigabytes. So if you're going to have more than 100,000 objects, or the number of objects that you're adding is going to make that database greater than 10 gigabytes, SQL Server 2012 Express is not going to work. If you can't qualify to use Express, you're going to need SQL Server 2008 or higher with the latest service pack. And one of the requirements for the version of SQL Server that you're going to be using with Azure AD Connect, there's a configuration called collation. And there's hundreds of these collation settings out there, and some of them have CI in them, which is case insensitive. We need to make sure the collation that you're using is case insensitive. So those are the software requirements for Azure AD Connect. A little bit more on the hardware requirements now. Again, back to the number of objects in the Active Directory. That's going to be your drive for the hardware requirements. Fewer than 10,000. CPU 1.6 gigahertz. In fact, if you go all the way down to greater than 600,000, the CPU is 1.6 gigahertz or higher. The memory starts changing. Fewer than 50,000 objects in AD, you have to have 4 gigabytes of memory and 70 gigabytes of drive space. So the big difference between the fewer than 10,000 and then 10,000 to 50,000 is really going to be SQL Server. It's not really CPU memory or drive space. 50,000 to 100,000 objects. 16 gigs of RAM now and 100 gigs of drive space. You get over 100,000 to 300,000, 32 gigs with 300 gigabytes of space. Between 300,000 and 600,000, again 32 gigs, but now we need 450 gigs of space, and then anything greater than 600,000, You're going to stay with the 32 gigs and then 500 gigabytes of drive space. And then that's okay because there's not that much difference between 50,000 items and over 600,000 items when it comes to drive space, and drive space is dirt cheap nowadays. If you're going to use ADFS, the Active Directory Federation Services, or web application servers, CPU requirements are dual core 1.6 gigahertz or higher, memory 2 gigabytes or higher, and the Azure VM has to be the A2 configuration or higher. So just a few areas around hardware that you need to be familiar with when you're planning for the deployment of Azure AD Connect, and you're looking at the number of objects that are going to be synchronized between the two locations. Now, along with that, we also have some connectivity requirements. Port numbers: DNS TCP/UDP port 53, Kerberos TCP/UDP port 88, RPC port 135 on TCP, LDAP TCP or UDP port 389, SSL obviously TCP port 443, and then SMB TCP 445. So if you're working with firewalls and you're worrying about what firewall ports need to be open, these are the ones that you're going to need to be concerned with or familiar with as you're considering the deployment of Azure AD Connect. And if you want some additional information with some details regarding these prerequisites for Azure AD Connect, you can actually go to the internet and do a search for Azure AD Connect prerequisites. And this website will give you information about what you need to do prior to installing Azure AD Connect, the component prerequisites. It even gives you information regarding the prerequisites for a federation installation and configuration, which is ADFS, as well as more information on your supporting components and their hardware requirements. And lastly, but not leastly, the steps to install Azure AD Connect are shared from this site as well.